Welcome those of you who came. I see I lost the coin toss for the Friday before we weekend, so so be it. But I hope to make it worth your while anyway. To begin today, I'm going to revive the picture of the future Bart Simpson and family up here that I showed you in the first lecture. Not so much that it's necessarily relevant to the discussion of photography going into the 20s, but to the fact that I want you to always bear this picture in the back of your mind, or a picture similar to it, because this is the way most people still knew photography in the first half of the 20th century. It was something that you could have a camera, you could practice yourself, but it's also mainly something that you participated in terms of the production of an image, usually commercially, and you set yourself a sort of ideal of how you saw yourself or how your family saw itself. And most family snapshots, besides whatever your roll film camera, also you went to the studio and had a commercial portrait made of yourself for your family. So this is the way that most people experienced photography at this time. I show you that because everything that follows right now pretty much tried to break those rules, tried to go away from those rules. And yet this was the continuum, and in fact the continuum that photography came back to, starting in the 30s and the 40s. Before we go there, however, in the next lecture we're going to take you veering far in left field and right field today. So to give you a set of what's there, just keep the traditional in the back of your mind too. To reflect on where we've been with the movements in photography in the late 19th century, pictorialism, impressionism, that all blended into modernism, and what we saw in the first 2 decades of the 20th century by some of the people who began to champion the movement. You saw it in the works of people like Kandinsky, like Bala and the Futurists, like Leger, like Duchamp, and others, and finally you saw it smashing up against the reality of the war. So that is what began with that. But between the wars, this whole evolution of vision began to change. Things began to affect the world that people lived in various ways, and those structures began to really have an impact in what photography and indeed all the arts were doing at the time. It became much more international in its expansion. It began to be a reaction to the world and the problems that had evolved into the final World War I and what was coming out of it, that sort of age of cynicism that Dan talked about in his lectures. That photography began to actively be combined with other media, that you could begin seeing things through things like collage and photomontage that brought in prints, that brought in painting, that brought in a serious attempt to alter the image somewhat or to change it somewhat. Not that photography hadn't been. People have always been retouching or playing with the image since the beginning of photography, but certainly it became much more prevalent in things like collage and things like photomontage that were going on at this part of time. You also saw the rise of the illustrated press that was beginning at this time too. We were getting away from the journals that had engravings and getting into early halftone reproductions and into better quality of reproductions, and even into fine printing like photogravures, transferring not just to drawings and prints, but indeed to photographs as well. And that was going to lead to what became photojournalism and candid photography. You saw the advent of more politics into the medium. You saw it being consciously attempted to try and influence thought more frequently, and also became a growing, of course, mass audience for this work. Through the various media that were arising, more people could be affected and be touched by it. And finally, always continue to remember the fact of that fascination with industry and technology that was always there and remains so. That one of the first movements to come actually before the war even was Dadaism. You've read Hugo Ball, you've read some of the other writers, including Tristan Tzara, who actually founded the movement, who began to express this movement. I'm not going to sit here and try and define Dada because I've never been successfully of the opinion that the people who invented it could define it. They made it purposely counterproductive. They made it purposely ambiguous. They wanted to confront you with the idea that there were rules that were being broken even if they didn't define any of the rules or the rules that were breaking those rules. In fact, Zara, who was probably the most serious proponent of this work in laying out the lectures on Dada and the handbooks and writings that he did, brought it on this way, that it's, quote, a state of mind, and that is why it transforms itself according to races and events. Dada applies itself to everything, and yet it is nothing. It is the point where the yes and the no and all the opposites meet, and not solemnly in the castles of human philosophies, but very simply in street corners like dogs and grasshoppers. Like everything in life, Dada is useless. Dada is without pretension, as life should be. Dada divided itself into many different movements throughout Europe, starting in the teens and running into the 20s. Ball became one of the first to create this manifesto, and indeed, if you want to give it a birth date, many people do, it started at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich on July 14th, 1916. If you want to begin throwing anniversary parties, do so at that point. But between him and especially Zara, who was really the chief promoter of the movement, they began to reject the pretty pictures of Impressionism and the painters of the era. They began to reject Futurism and the other modernist movements. They proclaimed that Dada was everything, chance, collision. The world was coming apart, and it was being reflected in this work. The photographer who represented us, of course, was the man who created shotograms, Christian Schad. These harken all the way back to the beginning of photography, when we had light-sensitive paper and we put objects on it and we exposed them to light, and we made this unique individual print of different symbolism. Schad tried to add more to the image so that it overlapped, so that it wasn't just a simple clean leaf print or something, but in fact different shapes, different three-dimensional pieces on top as well as flat pieces, and tried to give more complicated interpretations to the movement. In Berlin, photomontage was really the big difference with the Dada movement there. Things were meant to be seen as being much more complex and different to interpret. Also, this is where politics really entered in, was more with the Germans at this time. And photomontage began to be identified. Some of the Dadaists whose work you will see. Most Dada work is typical of this by Georges Gros. And just to make sure you understand what it is, Dada is incorporated, of course, into the movement. So if you see this image come up on your exam, you can pretty well guess this is a Dada image. But it has several other things too in it as well. It has pictures of political figures. It has hints of sex and individual portraits in it. It has, of course, references to the machine in the modern age too. And of course it has this implied chaos, which is in fact not chaos, but what Dada in fact is, which is nothing, and yet something here in front of you. Have I made it clear yet? No, of course not. Okay, but this is typical of the work that's done by Hajikalka and others who were using photographs at the time. Symbolic perhaps of what? Is this a comment upon the rich? Is this a comment upon loosening morals of the time? Is this a comment upon the fact that there is a certain decadent class structure within society? He never says. He just creates an intriguing image and lets you react to it in your own way. Similarly, I should also admit at this time that Dada was one of the first movements to bring film into the process. There are film movements that began to be shown too. And if I ever show you an example of film in Dada, it will be surely as confusing and as complex as you see with the still images too. At the same time in Germany, there was a sort of opposite movement that was more formal, that was more structured, and it was centered around something called the Bauhaus. Established by an architect, Walter Gropius, in 1919, it had several manifestations. It was finally thrown out by the Nazis in 1933 and moved to Chicago, where it became part of the Institute of Design. It continued to have an impact not only on photography or painting, but indeed all the fine arts, and most especially perhaps architecture and crafts and the way you lived your life. Its main attempt was to try and unify all these things, so in fact was sort of much the opposite of Dada. It tried to say that there was a structure inherent in life and lived it. People like the chief disciple Moholy-Nagy and others who participated in this movement, so that the photomontages that people like Man Ray and others created, or Moholy-Nagy in this case, were much more structured, much more dreamlike in their look, not as mechanistic or as chaotic as something like Schad. The emphasis was on architecture, on lifestyle, on new shape and design. Graphics were implied and used throughout this movement Indeed, shapes and the retouching of the photograph were very common at the time. And photo collage, of course, could be used to imply not only a harmony, but also a dissonance within the work. This particular work by Herbert Bayer, Lonely Metropolis, as it's titled, of course, has both alienation and industrialization and urbanization all taken into account in the work. In Paris, Dadaism became much more of a sort of movement that was not interested in political activism, but rather in affecting culture. Its great disciple was André Breton, who was the guiding force under it. He was influenced by Freud in the world of dreams and felt that human behavior was guided by these same deep forces that Freud was talking about. He felt so much and so strongly about it that by 1924 he declared Dada dead, to be replaced by Surrealism. But if you look at some of the work of the Paris Dadaists, the people like Duchamp and especially Man Ray, you will see this implication of design within this structure. So that Man Ray, for example, could draw association from the naked back of his current mistress with the shape of a fiddle. Or portraiture, which was not just portraiture, but in fact a statement upon alienation and design. All this eventually led to what Breton was taking it with the Surrealist movement. 1924. So you can see that by the 20s, Dadaism was being structured as being a dead art and was being followed by the Surrealists, and Surrealism really lived on into the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. Probably it lived as long as people like Max Ernst and Salvador Dali were taking breaths, because it continued to shape life in different irrational ways. But it was a bit more, well, it was less really seriously political or anti-establishment. It became more concerned with dreams and with the subconscious. It really relied upon what Freud was saying. And as the psychological revolution of the 20th century continued on in the decades ahead, it began to have its continuing practitioners. Surrealists included people like Man Ray, Belloc, Casson. And the statement that Breton made in 1924 is, I think, perhaps very important. Dictated by the thought, in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. It is free and of its own self. You perhaps most know this work through the work of people like Dali and the paintings that he did, but it was practiced as well by the photographers too. Man Ray, of course, again using photomontage, but this time it has a structure. It has an association. What is in fact a combination of scraps and metal may imply such organic things as flowers and flowing shapes. Hans Bellmer, who would treat the design of work by using shapes within dolls that he would tear up and put together in collages and then hand color. Or people like Winifred Casson, who would use double exposures and triple exposures to imply emotions that might be hidden behind the face. One of our favorite ones from the time. This is not actually Dali's photograph. It's the work of a New York photographer named Philip Halsman, but Dali collaborated with him starting in the 20s and going on for some 30 years. This is, of course, Dali Atomicus. This is flying Dali and flying everything else in the picture, too. I will just say that that particular image took at least 12 exposures to get everything right, and included a studio which had something like 6 assistants. From people who held the chair to people who threw the water to people who threw the cats. All this is an attempt to take the reality of the photograph and transform it some way. You're locked into this picture. Pardon?
I'm sure the cats felt the same way.
Oh yeah, the cats love it, of course. Yeah.
They need.
Yeah. But hey, for art you have to make sacrifice. Okay, but in fact, you know, what do you do with a process that is based in reality? That, you know, it comes in here and takes your picture, and that's your picture, and it's you in real life sitting there in the concrete world. All these attempts, whether the photo collages, whether the Dadaists, whether the Surrealists, was the attempt to transform the reality of the photograph in some manner or fashion, to try and take it beyond those realms. The second movement that was occurring, starting with the war and going on into the 20s, was social realism. This one, of course, grew up in the Soviet Union, following the rise of Lenin. It tried to define the art in terms of the nation itself, that the role of the artist was not to sit there and advance his own self-expression or his own emotional state, but rather to be part of a constructive, larger society. To build, to be the engineer, to reshape life, to make it better. Production art was what was involved. Technology must now mold that new society. It must be used in all avenues, in all directions. What was called, I think, factura, discovering a medium's distinctive capabilities by experimenting with its inherent qualities and trying to see how it worked. The basic gospel at the bottom, truth is shaped by reality, and reality is shaped by ideas. And the implication beyond that, ideas are shaped by the state. With the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the rise to power of the Bolsheviks, documentary traditions like this to actually show one of the riots were slowly being replaced by documents which celebrated the state. It's documents which showed the actual rise of Lenin to power and the conditions that he was going to transform. One of the conditions he transformed as well was anybody who was a rival who got in his way was suddenly removed from the picture. That could be done. Some of the earliest photo manipulation was occurring at this time too. But above all this championing of the image, the photograph became the basis for drawings, for prints, and especially for posters. Posters which could betray the ideal and become part of the shaping of the whole movement and idea of what was coming. So that in fact the idea became greater than any individual or any work. Photographs were used for different segments and then divided up and put in with championship slogans. This has continued, starting with the Bolsheviks, up to the present day. It consists in modern works too. The statement, which includes the word forward, for example, has popped up in the current president campaign too. And just to make you think that I'm not on either side, it's also been used by the Black Caucasus as well to decry Dick Cheney in the 2006 elections as well. So the manipulation of the image for posterization is prevalent throughout that. But most importantly, I think, when you see it rise in the Bolshevik work, what became photographs used as models for drawings, for etchings, for the building and making of these posters, and it went on under Stalin in the 30s and 40s too. Here's an example of how they were used in the course. If you worked in a factory working for the good of the society, on your lunch break, on your coffee break, you came and sat down and you had a lecturer show you these posters which reflected the ideals, which reflected the production figures, which told you what was going on to the future. The photograph was used as part of this teaching, part of this structure, part of this design. So with revolutionary art and social realism became the rise of some of the practitioners as well in this period of time in Soviet Russia. It was used by photographers to reestablish the historical record, to rewrite history, to present a more heroic image of the work too. And it began to be used, we went back and found photographs from World War I and used them, in fact, in our design for posters later on in the course of the evolution of that decade. El Lissitzky, who was another Russian designer, actually used it in an attempt to try and complicate the vision that was going on at the time and to praise such things as, in this case, engineering. This particular image is called The Constructivist, which championed, of course, the movement of constructivism during this time, too. The engineer's hand, which you see is framed with his eye, exactly in the double print here as well, plus the charts and drawings, the design and the feature and the graphics that all come together in this new vision. Photographs were used to also celebrate the state in these ways, such as multiple printing, the eye of the woman and the man double printed over each other with the victorious rise of the proletariat and the factories producing good, clean industry with good, clean smoke. Certain photographers and certain artists were able to take this and adapt it even further and play the game and essentially come up with new works. Perhaps the one that I think most likely is the one at the bottom here, Alexander Rodchenko. Rodchenko started out with drawing, took up photography in the teens and the 20s, and went back to painting in the 40s. But while he was doing this work in the 20s and 30s, he came up with some rather amazing photographs as well. Ones that did not really have so much of a political theme, but more of an aesthetic theme to them. So he could use these slanted angles, this dramatic lighting that existed in this work, and use it to an effect, such as this portrait of a person in Berlin, or this picture, which indeed has political overtones. These are shipyard workers working in the factory, and for the break, one of the socialist bands playing to entertain them for their break as well. Now, you could just sit down here and get in the middle and take a picture of the guys pulling their work. But for somebody like Rodchenko, he would try and find the odd angle, try and find the tight cropping, try and find the design within the social implication that was there. That's where you could take this work beyond what was there. The big thing about social realism was that it was pointed all in one direction. It showed the worker in the field as a happy, productive person. It showed the ideal of the state at all times. It did not show the technical documentary side. Photographs like this have only emerged in the last 20 years from the archives of Russia now because they are being found. Some photographers were taking this side, which was hidden, which was not shown at the time as well. But equally important to the people who were starving at this time and to the classes that were suffering at the time as well. But photography still managed to be made, even if it was betrayed by the particular state as well. So where does photography fit in all this? Well, I showed you this quote from George Bernard Shaw, which is a rather somewhat snobbish, somewhat aesthete look at where things are going. Are you a photographer, are you an artist, or are you merely a picture fancier? Again, are you know photographs only as part of the Bart Simpson ideal homogeneous family, or are you capable of learning more from it? The man in America who first brought this question to the fore was a German, he was of German ancestry. He was actually born in America. His name was Alfred Stieglitz. And Stieglitz from early on championed photography as the modern art medium. His early work, even from the beginnings, was somewhat decidedly different. A picture of a girlfriend he made in Germany in the 1890s does not depict a person smiling and anything like that, but rather an image of her industriously at work, taken through this very graphic structure of blinds and light coming in through the window, with other still images tacked to the wall behind her. In the 1900s, he established an organization called the Photo Secession. He ran a gallery in New York City, and he began to put around him a number of people who he thought were somewhat better than the amateur photo clubs of the day. He started out working with an amateur photo society until pretty soon, when he tried to redesign their newsletter, they threw him out. So he set up his own movement, which he called the Photo Secession. Primarily, it was to be international in scope. That is to say, it was to make American painting on the same equivalent par with American photography on the same equivalent par with that of European painting. That the progress was there not for the masses, but for the fanatical enthusiasm of the revolutionists. It employed a lot of photomechanical printing. Gelatin silver, which was the photochemical process of the day, was used as part of the process of making the images, but the final images were largely things like gum prints using artistic gum, or photogravure using ink on paper. The hand camera became an equally important artistic tool. And he opened a number of series of galleries in New York City, which evolved over the next 30 years to show this work. He also founded a magazine called Camera Work, more about that in a minute. But he thought that photographic work should be anti-photographic, that above all it should be more personal, more spiritual, and transcend beyond the subject. This is a famous statement of Stieglitz upon which he based the whole photo-secessionist movement, which to him was absolutely true. I was born in Hoboken, I'm an American, photography is my passion, the search for truth, capital T, my obsession. Are you paying attention out there, philosophers? Okay, 1907, while crossing the Atlantic on board the Kaiser Wilhelm II, he was walking the deck one day, saw this image in the steerage compartment of the ship, went back to his cabin, got his camera out, had one more exposure on the reel of film, went up to the upper deck of first class and photographed down into steerage and made this image, which became The Steerage, as it was published in 1907. What do you see in that picture? Anybody?
Contrast?
What?
Contrast?
Contrast of what? The what? I can't hear you. What?
Glasses?
The classes? Okay.
Yeah, the
Okay.
contrast for everyone.
Okay. Good social observer there. Next. Someone else. Don't hesitate.
The rich are above the poor.
What?
The rich are physically above the poor.
The rich are physically above the poor. Okay. I told you before at the beginning that this image was one of those that was often misinterpreted. It was meant to show the poor huddled masses coming to America when in fact there was, of course, a ship going back to Germany. But 1908, the year afterwards, this is what he said about the work. This is the way he wrote about it. What I saw a round straw hat, the funnel leaning left, the stairway leaning right, the white drawbridge with its railing made by circular chains, white suspenders crossing on the back of a man in the steerage below, round shapes of iron machinery, a mast cutting into the sky, making a triangular shape. I saw a picture of shapes, and underlying that, the feeling that I had about life. You remember Jacob Riis, the man who went in the 1890s and 1900s into the slums of New York and photographed there. He undoubtedly would have seen poverty here in the lower levels. He would have seen the contrast with the upper levels as you saw. Jacob Riis, 20 years later would have much seen the same thing too. Many social documentarians would have. Stieglitz didn't care for that. Stieglitz felt there were deeper levels to a photograph. Underlying things about shape, about form, about design, about color, about contrast, about tone, which gave it its own emotional impact. And his job as a photographer was to find those deeper emotional levels and transfer them into a tangible form and present them to you. This was radical for the early 1900s because we always wanted to interpret a picture as literally. We still do. Nothing wrong with your interpretation of what you saw there, certainly. We still want to read it that way. But for Stieglitz, there were deeper levels to photographs. And this is what he wanted to try and establish with the photo secession. He wanted to get away from the big, clumsy cameras on tripods and get back to the hand camera like these. These are typical of that particular day. Probably typical of the type of camera used to take that picture. We don't do art to that level. Let me go back one. We don't do art to that level, but this is the type of art he was producing. He was not interested in showing you one particular building. He was not interested in sharing with you the plight of the street sweeper. He saw design. He saw structure. He saw the city as something that evoked a greater emotional level in him than the mere recording of the fact of it. And that's sometimes hard to appreciate, but it's there. The terminal in 1912, during the winter time when the horses would sweat pulling the trolley and would come around the corner and the trolleys would empty and new passengers would get on and the horses paused for a while and the steam from their overheated bodies contrasted with the snow and the cold. He did not see it as suffering for the horse. He did not see it as a document of the city. He saw it as an emotional thing. And this is the type of movement he brought to this organization called the Photo Secession. And he gathered around him other photographers like this. As the name implies, there's some seceding from the pictorialist traditions of the day. They're doing something more, something deeper here as well. Clarence White, who lived all his life in Ohio, by the way, once asked Stieglitz, what are we? And Stieglitz says, well, we're the Photo Secession. He says, what's that? Well, we're seceding. What's that? Well, we're the Photo Secession. And on and on like this. Maybe you read too much Gertrude Stein. But anyway, the point is that was what he felt at the time. And pictorialists began to depart into this sort of realm as well. One of his champions was Edward Steichen, an early practitioner from Minnesota. Steichen wanted to be a painter but took up photographs very early on. This is his portrait of J.P. Morgan. Morgan was a difficult subject for him because the multi-billionaire was not somebody who liked to pose well, but Steichen got the picture he wanted. It has many different levels, but it's loved today by the socialist class is because it looks like the arm of the chair is actually a butcher knife aiming for the subject looking at the picture. So it's got different levels it's been read at as well. This is typical of the day too. For example, one of Clarence White's photograph, all design. He actually took the picture one morning of his two kids running off to school. But the picture has certain structure and certain design tensions in it that are very nice. Typical imagery as well. The soft focus of pictorialism somewhat still remained, but you weren't supposed to interpret it that way. You're supposed to interpret it more in terms of its emotional impact. As I said, in 1904 he founded Camera Work, which went through 50 issues between then and when it folded in 1917. Camera Work was a photographic quarterly celebrating photography. This is the credo for it, a force for light today, tomorrow and the days thereafter. Above all, photography was seen as a means of self-expression, and he wanted people to see it big. Fearless, with no if. Hear me? Hear that, Kipling? Got that? No if whatsoever. Okay. Typical of the work again, this is another one of Steichen's pictures from early on. Steichen was independently wealthy. He moved back and forth between Europe and America quite a bit. This is his famous picture of Rodin contemplating his sculpture of the Thinker. You note, you can't tell what Rodin looks like. You can't even tell that much about the Thinker as a statue. It's a very dark and moody picture. And the main part of it is taken up with not Rodin or the Thinker, but that other bas-relief in the back. This is typical of the type of work that was done. It is the emotional state of thought, of creativity that's being shown here, rather than a portrait of Rodin. One of the things Steichen did was send European art back to Stieglitz to see. And Stieglitz, in the pages of a journal called Camera Work, was the first American journal to publish early work by Picasso and early writings by people like Gertrude Stein. In the pages of a magazine called Camera Work? Hey, come on. We're supposed to be taking pictures of the family, not talking about art and literature. And indeed, the little photo galleries that he ran would also often include sculpture and photography and paintings by a number of these European photographers, introducing European work to the American scene, mixed with photographs. So you had the work of painters like Arthur Dove, or the woman who became Stieglitz's wife, Georgia O'Keeffe. This early impact work was first seen in the photographic galleries, and Stieglitz was sitting here saying, it all works together. It's all about self-expression. It's all about the emotions that the artist carries forth and presents to the person looking at it. In the realm of photography, that was still staggering. And in fact, probably that's some sort of weird two-level theory, if you will, that exists to this day. Do we counterpoint realism with emotion here as well? And what is, in fact, the middle ground, if any, between them? Stieglitz went on and celebrated New York City, again as a place of shapes, not as a definition of architecture or a definition of being. Nearly all his pictures of New York don't include people. They're of design. He did radical things like not try and show you the top of the building. He'd cut it off and make it a study of shape and design. And finally, in the late 20s, he went totally overboard, depending on your interpretation of overboard, and did something he called equivalents, which were studies of the sky and the clouds. And these were to be read as equivalents, equivalent of his nature and the emotion he felt being translated to you. These pure abstractions of light, not manipulated, not transformed like the Dadaists, not cut up or photo collaged or anything like that. Straight photographs, but still with their own inherent mysticism and their own inherent emotional value. Pictorialism began to decline rapidly in that atmosphere. The hand camera rather than the view camera to take its place. Experimentation came in, and straight photography was again celebrated. We didn't have to manipulate the print any longer. We didn't have to make pretty pictures of landscape. By the 1920s, things were starting to take dramatic shape. Henri Lartigue, even as a child, was taking pictures like this with a snapshot of his camera, not defining a particular car, but rather the whole sense of speed and motion. I've always thought this had some sort of futurist implication to it itself, but in fact, Lartigue was about, I think, 10 when he took this picture, so maybe not. But people like Alvin Langdon Coburn, another member of the photo secession, was using this work in different ways. He did an illustrated book on London, which tried to show London not as a city of just great buildings, but a city of atmosphere, a city of fog, a city of feeling and emotion within the impact of where you live. He also championed the first attempt to really make abstract photographs with the camera, something he called Borda Graphs. And of course, this was inspired by the Vorticism movement that was written about by the subject of this picture, the poet Ezra Pound, who was also experimenting with literature at the time. So this is very typical of that particular era. I think this was done about 1917, 1918. Again, a world war raging and about to end, and the shape of how we look at it there. Probably the greatest person to disciple to come out of this whole photo-secessionist movement was a man named Paul Strand. Strand, again, Midwesterner, who began to define the works that would shape Stieglitz and take them sort of one step removed, closer towards the abstracts, closer towards the pictorialists, to the Cubists and the other modernists. This was his particular statement, that it's a long road by which you learn this craftsmanship, but you must practice it, no shortcuts, no rules. Strand's work was very direct, always, and yet very complicated. Remind you of a certain Cubist painter from the turn of the century. Light patterns upon shapes that were juxtaposed, underexposed, overexposed. He also took up film in the 20s, and one of his earliest subjects was his movie camera. He photographed the mechanism of the movie camera as an abstraction. Or the famous Rancho de Taos church. He was the first to try and find its shape and its inherent form. And even his portrait of Wall Street, which again has been interpreted in different social contexts, was meant to be first and foremost a study of shape and design. Also should point out changes in technology at this time, because what's happening in the 20s is becoming something that's going to shape the next remainder of the century. First off, the camera is going to get smaller. We no longer have the big plate cameras being used by the most photographers. Yes, they will still be in existence to an extent. But in 1924, the Germans invented the Leica, a small 35mm camera. It changed the format of film. It was on a roll. It had sprockets. It sat in a small hand. You could put it in your hand. You could do all the focusing and mechanism. The camera was off the tripod. You could move about with it. Films got faster. You could take pictures in low light levels much easier. Flash bulbs were now available. You could bring in artificial lighting. You no longer had to deal with just regular light in the room. This led to a rise in photojournalism in new ways, which we'll see in the 30s. We also evolved into the era of first motion pictures that was at all practical for the application of newsreels and documentaries. And indeed, this faster pace of life that was first reflected in people like the futurists began to be reflected in photography as well. An example of the Leica camera in its case, for example. The early flash bulbs. The illustrated press that was coming along at the time, which had employed the photograph together with collage and multiple printings. Two examples from Germany after the war. And indeed the portability of the image, which was used in the use of the press too. Most typically in the 20s, when Ruth Schneider was convicted of killing her husband and was sentenced to death and was executed in the electric chair, a news photographer strapped a small camera to his ankle and took the picture of the moment of death. This is the whole entire frame that was recorded. This is the way it was actually used in the Daily News in the 20s. Combination of the graphic with the photographic in a new, different way with mass distribution. This would be continued in the 30s. This is a page we're going to see in our next talk on the subject of Life, or the first issue actually of Life magazine, and how it was going to transform the way the image was going to be presented to you. The big revolution at this time, beyond all this, was probably cinema. And we should talk briefly in closing about cinema, because that was the truly collaborative art form which evolved starting in the 1890s up to the present day. We began from that early time to learn the language of the motion picture camera and what it could do. Subjects were documentaries, or shorts of entertainment, very short reels, often silent at the time, of course, because sound did not come in until the 30s. Black and white film, technical experimentation with these sort of things that occurred. And probably centralized production and distribution would help this rise of this medium as well. I point out some typical films. These are not all my favorite films, but just what they represent in terms of the evolution of cinema at the time. William Heiss's The Kiss, which was the first, I guess, attempt at some sort of narrative film in the 1890s. It ran, I think, for a total of something like 43 seconds. Big feature, showed gentlemen how to properly kiss a lady. I always love the flourish he gives to his handlebar mustache before he plants it on her, too. Georges Méliès, who was a stage musician, the first attempts at special effects in the terms of novelty in the work. This is his Voyage to the Moon, done in the first decade of the 1900s, which had sets and which had special effects. Even more interesting, the one he did a couple of years later on the conquest of the North Pole, which had incorporated the first attempts at social comment as well. The explorers were a multicultural group, including a Texan, a Mexican, a Frenchman, an Oriental, all of course Frenchmen in costumes at the time. And it also included such social commentary as an attempt by the suffragettes to win a place on board the flight to the North Pole. I'm sorry, ladies, they didn't succeed. If they tried, instead they got to be part of the special effects of the plane flying through the night sky. And of course, in a terrifying finale when they met the North Pole monster. The Great Train Robbery, one of the first real narratives to be attempted, filmed in the Wild West of in rural New Jersey by Edison's outfit, using stage sets, using outdoor camera, and perhaps one of the first to actually break the mold between the screen and the audience, when at the very end one of the cowboys turned and shot the pistol right into the face of the audience. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, perhaps the first real epic in film, an attempt in 1912 to tell the story of the Civil War and the post-Reconstruction era. Now, of course, an extremely racist picture, very anti-black, very, as you can tell from the poster for the film, celebrated the Ku Klux Klan as the heroes. But at the same time, a staggering piece of production, such as you've never seen before, ran for well over an hour. And the following year, he created an even bigger colossal called Intolerance, which was a play that took place in 4 different ages, all hosted by time endlessly rocking the cradle to tell these 4 different tales. It included one of the first cast of thousands, if you will, and it created great spectacle at the time. It's quite impressive to see. It runs for over 2 hours, which was a real something for people who were used to one-reelers of like 10 minutes or so. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which came out of Expressionist Germany at this time with the Expressionist paintings.
It's the best movie.
Okay. Like I said, all you're going to have different tastes in this, and that's fine. One of the first early horror films, but the sets were dramatic, again, influenced by the same expressions and the same dreamlike qualities that were there. A sense of menace, a sense of foreboding, a sense of mystery throughout. And into the 20s, this was the final silent decade. It saw the rise of the studio system, the rise of the star system, the solidifying of that particular whole system internationally and in Hollywood, and these new forms of propaganda and documentary.
What do you mean by the final decade of silence?
Final decade of silent films. Sound was going to be discovered in the end, as we'll see in a moment. But this was sort of still all silent images. And so you have to remind yourself in some of these films, if you haven't seen them, that you're basically sitting in a room with just the sound of the projector, or else somebody adding additional music to change the mood of the image. But they were silent images without soundtrack. Sergei Eisenstein, who invented new techniques of cinema at the time, especially the collage image and photomontage. The Battleship Potemkin, which was done shortly after the Russian Revolution to celebrate the independent rebellion of sailors on board a Russian ship in 1905. The Russian army photograph shooting the citizens on the steps of Odessa, that was done in collage, which is a dramatic moment to see, especially a bunch of snippets of film to imply the overall horror of the moment. And of course the use also of close-up and documentary. Eisenstein created a whole language of photography at the time. He included such things as close. It could also come up close to the camera if you wanted to for close-ups too, as well as far away. He moved the camera about, he got out and moved too. All these things were movements there. It was such a successful film that the next year the Russian government hired him to do a story called October, which was of course the story of the October Revolution, done with actors celebrating the rise of Lenin. That was supposed to come out in the teens. Problem was, number one, Lenin died in 1921. The other Russians took over. Finally, Stalin got involved, and various versions of October were done over the next 20 years. Eisenstein pretty much gave up on it, but it continued to be something that was redone and redone over and over again. Politics entered the film of filmmaking as well. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which had to do with the future, but was much more an indictment of socialism and working conditions, and the workers at the time depicted as servants to the machine and to time until the ultimate rebellion against the machine. Wings, which was an attempt by William Wellman in 1927, an attempt to depict World War I aviation, an adventure story which actually put the camera in the plane and showed you the dogfights filmed that way. I've always thought it was significant that in doing Star Wars, George Lucas screened wings to give his special effects guys the ideas of how he wanted the effect with the winged fighters in the film. And finally, 1929, Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer, the first attempt to put sound into an image in any sort of structured narrative way. A critical movie in and of itself. Certainly had other references, again, Jolson singing in blackface, the attempt to divert back to vaudeville, the overt racism of the movement was there, but at the same time this mix of actually putting sound and image really staggered people as they saw it too. With film, you have an addition of a technical expansion of the photographic image, the painted image, to some other means of expression that's going to continue to revitalize the whole movement as we go throughout the 20th century. But always go back to that first image. Always see how you saw yourself. Because we've taken you far afield between social realism, the Dadaist movement, the pictorialist movement, and the photo-secessionists that went on in the teens and the 20s here. We're about to come back to reality in the 30s. We're going to have to, because the world is going to start dragging us back into reality too at the time, as you're going to see with Dan's lectures too. That's part of the whole condition and training that's there. But always remember the core of where the image came from, because you keep returning to that every day. And every time you put that little camera up to your eye, you will it too. Good luck, UT. Have a good weekend.